And for purposes of the sort of catch-all exception, well, incidentally, before I get there, the statement against interest in criminal cases also requires some indication of trustworthiness before they can be admitted in a criminal case.
Well, isn't that taken care of by a court finding that it is so far contrary to the person's penal interest? That's the reliability part. Otherwise, we would have needed the second part of the rule, which says that if it's an inculpatory statement but exculpates another, you have to have corroboration. That same corroboration requirement does not seem to apply to the first sentence. And I say that to just note that it's almost saying it has to be, it's corroborated or it is considered reliable because it is so clearly and far contrary to a person's penal interest.
The statement against interest has an additional requirement in criminal cases, and that is some indication of trustworthiness for the entire statement. So it's similar to the analysis under the sort of catch-all exception, 807. And, there's a lot about Mr. Hall's statement that is self-serving and unreliable.
For example?
I'm sorry?
For example?
For example, he denies giving any pills to Mr. Floyd, denies that he had pills. We know a lot of that is not, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that's not true. He gave false information at the scene at least twice. He did flee from Minnesota and had to be apprehended in Texas. He gave very sketchy details about his own involvement. He denied having any fake money, passing any fake money. So there are a lot of reasons to doubt Mr. Hall's credibility when analyzing the entire giving of this statement. It's very self-serving, obviously. And
what are your thoughts regarding the body of evidence that would be considered that he could legitimately take a Fifth Amendment claim of compelled self-incrimination versus, is it smaller, larger, or as counsel said, the same group of factors that fall under 804b3 statement against penal interest?
That's I think the primary point I was trying to make. The evidence that counsel thinks can come in despite the invocation of the Fifth Amendment, none of that is a statement against interest. It's a description he had of others, of Mr. Floyd. That's not implicating himself and thereby not creating a statement against interest or something that would implicate him beyond the obvious fact that he is present. He's present in a vehicle where drugs are present. There are indications that he may not have been truthful when he said he didn't give Mr. Floyd any pills and may not have been aware of that. And in our proposed questions, he will have to be asked if he was under the influence of any controlled substances that day, because it fundamentally affects his ability to know, remember, and relate. And that, I think, we will have then potentially an invocation just on that question alone. But that sphere of evidence counsel wants to put in through Mr. Hall does not constitute a statement against interest. Other statements he made, through which I think even the court realizes he would have the right to invoke the Fifth Amendment, are what counsel is claiming are these statements against interest. So the statements he wants in don't fit under that exception. They're just plain hearsay. And so that's the fundamental problem that we have with trying to limit this sphere of information to come out of Mr. Floyd, or to come out of Mr. Hall, is that they're not a statement against interest.
All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this under advisement until after lunch. I'll look at the super case and consider counsel's arguments, and I'll give you a ruling at 1 o'clock before we bring the jury back.
Would you repeat site for super?
Yes, please.
It's at 781 Northwest 2D 390, Minnesota, Court of Appeals, 2010.
All right. I'll take a look at that and consider counsel's arguments, and we'll come back at.
Your Honor, and for purposes, just for clarification, is In terms of the questions that I provided to the court, you had, as I understood the court's instructions, we were limiting those questions to just in the car.
Correct.
Time frame in the car. That's the basis. The statement that Agent Henning took that I would intend to potentially play would be more of a description because of what they did that day.
Right. Understood. Okay. Any other motions we have to deal with this morning? Otherwise, we should start up with the jury.
Yes, Your Honor.
The discussion we had in chambers relevant to last night's events.
Do you have a motion?
Make it
Let's do it.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, I am requesting, again, sequestration of the jury in view of the incidents of last night. As the court, I'm sure, is aware, an officer-involved shooting took place in the city of Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. As a result of that, there was some fairly extensive civil unrest that occurred. I would note for the court that we have at least one juror who's a resident of that particular city and other jurors who have connections to Brooklyn Center. Given that this is obviously a high-profile case, this is a case that evokes a lot of emotion for a lot of people. Ultimately, Your Honor, the question becomes: will the jury be confident to make a decision regardless of the potential outcome of their decision? There's two possible verdicts here, right? Guilty or not guilty. And my concern is that these jurors, and it's been an ongoing concern that a juror in Hennepin County being exposed extensively to the media before coming in and serving as a juror, being at least initially cautioned only to avoid news about this particular incident. We've questioned one juror already about whether she had seen some particular pieces of information that had not been presented in court. She, I felt, had credible responses to the court. But ultimately, this incident, while it is, I understand it's not this case. I understand that it does not involve these same parties. But the problem is that the emotional response that case creates sets the stage for a jury to say, I'm not going to vote not guilty because I'm concerned about the outcome. During voir dire, we had many jurors who, on both sides of the political or social debate, who expressed concern about if they don't agree, if the public doesn't agree with the verdict. This incident last night highlights, and I think brings it to the forefront of the jury's mindset, that a verdict in this case is going to have consequences, and they've been exposed to that already. So at this point, I would request that the court further voir dire, first and foremost, further voir dire jurors as to whether or not they have learned of this, because some jurors may be completely avoiding the media and some may not. So we should, I believe, first voir dire jurors to see what, if anything, they have learned about last night's events. Second, whether those events would have any impact on their decision-making process or concerns about their decision-making process. I think that the jury should be sequestered. I think that the jury should have been sequestered. I've made that clear in previous discussions and motions. I think the jury should have been sequestered throughout the pendency of this trial. And I think that the jury needs to be cautioned at the beginning of every day and at the end of every day to avoid all media. Again, we've had discussions about that in chambers. So I believe, Your Honor, that at a bare minimum, that's what should happen.
Does the state have a position?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. The state opposes the motion for sequestration. I don't believe that sequestration would be a remedy that would be appropriate or, frankly, effective in this matter. As counsel pointed out, it's a different case. It's a different department. It is an officer-involved shooting. It is something that happened nearby. We really don't know what the facts of the case are at this particular point as those things are unfolding. But world events happen. Things continue to happen in the state, despite the fact that we're all here in trial. That's just what happens. And we can't have every single world event that might affect somebody's attitude or emotional state or anything be the grounds to come back and re-voir dire all the jurors. The court, in our voir dire process, we asked the jurors, specifically the issue that Mr. Nelson is concerned about, whether they would be so concerned about the outcome of a verdict that they wouldn't be unable to be fair and impartial and render either a guilty or not guilty verdict. And all of the jurors who were sworn and impaneled said that they would be able to do that. And the court will further instruct them that they are to do that. They're to render their verdict without regard to the result. And the law presumes that jurors follow the court's instructions, and we should presume that they meant what they said when they said it, that they could set aside these external issues and decide the case based solely on the evidence. So I think it would be inappropriate to voir dire jurors now about events that, while related and being on the same topic of the case, do not involve this case. In terms of sequestration, I don't think that would be an effective remedy. Again, as far as the court admonishing the jurors to avoid all media, I don't oppose that request. I think that it does present some issues. If you order the jurors to avoid all media, man, it's very difficult to avoid all media. And we'd have to tightly define what does avoid all media mean. Years ago it used to mean don't read the newspaper, don't watch TV. It means something different now, I suppose. Media comes at us in all different forms. I think it'd be very difficult to follow an order to avoid all media. And while it might have the effect of reducing the media contact, I wouldn't want to have a situation where then if a juror inadvertently received some media on some unrelated thing, that would be a grounds of claiming juror misconduct because they didn't follow what would be a nearly impossible court order. So I think the court could fashion some guidance as to what to do. You could encourage them to avoid all media. You could even order them to do it, but if something inadvertently filters through, I think we can't overreact to it. I think we'd have to look at that on an individual basis, just like you did with the other juror question that we had the other day, and we found out that it really wasn't what we thought it could have been.
I'm going to deny the motion to sequester the jury and for additional voir dire. This is a totally different case. And I realize there's civil unrest, and maybe some of the jurors did hear about that. The reason why in my initial order I said we're not going to sequester, but we might go to it in the middle of trial if, and the concern there was that despite keeping jurors anonymous, that somebody may find out who one of the jurors is and reach out and have an inappropriate attempt to tamper with the jury. We have no indication that that's happened in this case, and that was the concern about going to sequestration. I understand the argument from the defense that this now puts them even more ill at ease, but I think sequestering them would only aggravate that. Oh, I heard about the civil unrest and now the judge is putting us into sequestration. There must be a greater threat to our security. I think the better way is to just continue with the trial as we've been going, that's a separate issue. They should treat it as such. It'd be a different story if it was civil unrest following another verdict, where the jury can see what the consequence of a certain verdict might be in a similar case, but that's not this case. The jurors all are aware and were concerned about their safety because of what happened in May of 2020, the civil unrest that followed there. Not a big surprise that there's now civil unrest in response to this case, but I don't think that should heighten the jurors' concern. I think it's probably the same as it was before. They all have a concern that they expressed and were very honest about. And so I'm not going to sequester them. We'll sequester them on Monday when we anticipate doing closings. So, and we'll proceed accordingly. So with that, let's bring in the jury. Morning, members of the jury. Sorry it took a little longer for the legal issues we had this morning, but we'll get started with our first witness for the day.
Good morning, Your Honor, counsel, ladies and gentlemen. The state will call Dr. Jonathan Rich.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth? I affirm. Right there. Thank you. AirPods? Thank you. Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Rich, you're a medical doctor. You have to answer yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Could you tell us where you're currently employed?
Sure. I am a cardiologist at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, Illinois, where I also am an associate professor of medicine at Northwestern University.
Dr. Rich, what have you come to talk to the jury about today?
I'm here as an expert cardiology specialist to provide my opinion as to how Mr. George Floyd died.
Have you ever testified in a court of law before?
This is my first time.
Would you briefly summarize for us your educational background?
Sure. So I attended the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign for my undergraduate studies, where I majored in biology and performed my pre-medical coursework.
Where did you go to medical school?
I went to the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York.
And do you know what a residency is?
Yes, I do know what a residency is.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what a residency is?
Sure. So after completing medical school, I went on to do training in internal medicine, and that training is referred to as a residency. I believe the term originated because you seem to spend all your time in the hospital. You were basically a resident there. And so that was a 3-year internal medicine residency.
And where did you do that residency?
I did that at the Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School.
Did you also have something called a fellowship?
Yes, I did.
What is a fellowship?
So upon completing internal medicine residency training, many will go on to practice at that point. I opted to specialize in cardiology. And so when you take on an additional specialty, that form of training is referred to as a fellowship.
And so did you do a fellowship?
Yes.
And where did you do your fellowship?
So I did my fellowship at the University of Chicago.
And were you what's known as a chief fellow?
Yes, I was the chief fellow.
What is a chief fellow?
So every fellowship program has about, on average, 18 cardiology fellows, 6 in each class. And so I was bestowed the honor to be the chief fellow, which is basically being the captain of the group.
Did you have any additional training then after your fellowship?
Yes, I did.
What was that?
So after completing cardiology fellowship, I decided that I wanted to sub-specialize further in a field of advanced heart disease that focuses on heart failure and heart transplantation.
Are you board certified?
Yes, I am board certified in both cardiovascular diseases and in advanced heart failure and transplant medicine.
Transplant cardiology?
That's correct.
What is transplant cardiology as a field?
So, thankfully, most people are not going to need a heart transplant, but on occasion, patients' hearts will worsen over time and get to the point where they're tremendously weak and can't function on their own anymore. The medicine isn't working. And so the field of transplant cardiology is one in which we try to see if we can find a suitable match for that individual to get them a heart transplant, essentially to restore their life.
Are you trained in basic and advanced cardiac life support?
Yes, I am. And I renew that training every 2 years as part of my job.
Let's talk a bit about your employment background. After you finished your fellowship, where did you go to work?
Right. So after completing the heart failure and transplant fellowship, I took my first position at the University of Chicago as a cardiovascular specialist in heart failure.
And were you employed there until May of 2013?
That is correct.
And where did you go to work after that?
So since May of 2013, I have been at Northwestern University, as I mentioned earlier, as one of the heart failure and transplant cardiologists.
Do you hold any leadership positions at Northwestern?
Yes, I do.
What's that?
So one of them is I am the medical director of the Mechanical Circulatory Support Program.
Mechanical Circulatory Support Program.
Right.
Now, what is that?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. But basically, we talked about heart transplant for a minute. So patients whose hearts become very weak and perhaps they're not a good suitable match for a transplant, or they just don't have time to wait for a transplant, we can implant mechanical heart pumps that, combined with their weakened heart, can restore blood flow to their body to improve their quality of life and allow them to live longer.
Do you have any other relevant leadership positions at Northwestern?
Yes, I do. I'm also the program director of the Advanced Heart Failure and Transplant Fellowship Training Program.
And what does your job then at Northwestern entail as relates to either heart disease, treatment, prevention?
Sure. So I could answer that by basically putting it into three major domains. As a cardiologist, I perform a lot of clinical work. That is probably the most intensive part of my job.
Before you go on, would you tell the jury what's meant by clinical work as compared to what?
Absolutely. Clinical work basically means patient care. Okay, so it's the actual acts of taking care of patients, whether it be in the hospital, outside the hospital. That's what we kind of think of when we say clinical. I also do a fair amount of education and teaching. I teach the students, residents, and fellows. I travel across the country and deliver lectures on a variety of cardiovascular topics and help chair medical meetings. And then the third part of my job as a cardiologist is I conduct clinical research and have been doing so in a variety of cardiovascular diseases for nearly 20 years.
Do you spend most of your time, though, providing clinical care to patients?
Yes, that is for sure the most intense aspect of my job.
And what does your clinical practice then entail in terms of taking care of patients?
Sure. So my clinical practice has three components. Number one is my job in the hospital. So I spend several months, sometimes 4 to 5 months of the year, as the lead cardiologist, rounding in the hospital, taking care of basically the sickest heart disease patients in the hospital, and I also oversee their care in the intensive care unit. The second part of my clinical duties is I see patients in the outpatient setting, in the office, in the clinic, where I evaluate, diagnose, and treat patients. Close to 50% of the patients, the new ones that I see in the clinic, are referred by other cardiologists because these patients can sometimes have pretty complex medical conditions. And then the third part of my clinical work is I perform procedures in a procedural suite we call the cath lab, where I measure pressures inside the heart and inside the lungs. And sometimes I will also take small biopsy samples of the inner lining of the heart for diagnostic purposes.
Given that you deal with a number of patients who could be really sick, do you ever have patients that will pass away?
So I work with a tremendous team at Northwestern, and my colleagues save countless lives, but unfortunately, many patients do die.
Do you ever have any involvement in determining the cause of death?
Oh, yes, I do.
Could you explain?
Sure. One of the most important parts of my job, in fact, is to determine what's wrong with the patient, including if they do actually die, how did they die? And so there are a number of ways in which I participate in that role of figuring out what happened to a patient, how did they die?
Are you involved in any hospital committees that have as their purposes determining the cause of why people die or pass away?
Sure, I do. So outside of being in the trenches, taking care of the patients at the bedside and figuring out what's going on and trying to discern what might have happened, I also participate on a committee that meets regularly. And what we do is we review all of the cases in the cardiac intensive care unit. We look at any near deaths and any deaths, and we review looking at the medical chart and all of the evidence to try to figure out what might have happened for quality purposes, to figure out if there was something else we could have done, and also to improve just our overall knowledge of the field.
Do you have experience with patients who sometimes pass away during what's called clinical trials?
Yes, so I also participate in clinical trials where we try to determine if a certain medication or a certain device is worthy of being approved to help patients. In the course of clinical trials, sometimes there are deaths. And so in my role, I have sat on committees, and our purpose on that committee is to review any deaths that do occur, look at all the evidence to figure out, number one, why did the death happen? And number two, and sometimes this is one of the more important parts, to distinguish, was it a cardiac cause or was it for a reason that is not related to the heart?
We're bringing this further home to this case. Do you have experience with cardiac patients who die from what we call low oxygen?
Oh, most certainly I do.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so because I am a cardiologist who takes care of patients in the intensive care unit, having low oxygen levels is not uncommon. A lot of different disease processes can cause it, and low oxygen levels can be very detrimental. Some of our patients require ventilators and respirators. And so in the course of caring for these patients, sometimes they succumb to their illness because their body is not able to get enough oxygen.
Do you ever have to determine cause of death in the heart transplant context?
Yes. So in the field of heart transplantation, what happens is when you get a phone call that somebody has died and they want to be an organ donor. So what I need to do is look at the case from afar, but try to look at all the records as closely as possible to really sort out how that individual died, and if there's any issues related to their heart or other parts of their body, to make absolutely sure that that heart would be a good match for my patient who we're trying to help. And so that's another element where you have to be really meticulous as you go through. You don't want to miss anything here, right? I mean, the stakes are way too high.
We've heard from a couple of pathologists in the trial. Does your job require you to work with pathologists?
Oh, yes, it does.
In what way?
So I work with cardiac pathologists actually pretty closely, perhaps more so than other general cardiologists. I mentioned that I take biopsy specimens of the inner lining of the heart, and I send those specimens to the pathologist to review under the microscope. We participate in conferences that include reviewing autopsies. One of the things that I have learned over the years, and I've been actually taught this by the cardiac pathologists, is that while a pathologist can look under the microscope and give us very important information, I work with a world-renowned cardiac pathologist who reminds me nearly every day, please tell me as much clinical information as you can. Put it in clinical context, because how I diagnose and interpret what I see under the microscope is very much influenced by the clinical story. And so we work very closely together, because my pathologist looks under the microscope and actually sees the tissue at that level, and I can provide all of the clinical information, the timelines, et cetera, so we can truly get it right.
Just a little bit more background, Dr. Rich. Have you published in the field of cardiology?
Yes, I have.
Can you generally characterize what kinds of publications and how many?
Sure. So to date, I've published more than 200 combined abstracts, original manuscripts, reviews, and book chapters. And the topics have been pretty wide-ranging in the field of cardiology, from coronary artery disease, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, congestive heart failure, and another disease actually called pulmonary hypertension.
And what is pulmonary hypertension?
Pulmonary hypertension is high pressures that are specific to the blood vessels in the lungs. All right, so when the blood flows from the heart to the lungs, if the pressure is high in those blood vessels, we refer to that as pulmonary hypertension.
Doctor, would you generally describe for the jurors what is cardiology as a science?
Sure. So cardiology is the study of the heart at the most basic level. It's the study of how the heart functions, what happens when the heart develops disease, pretty much everything heart-related and how it interacts with the rest of the body in order to sustain life.
How do you go about assessing a patient with a cardiology issue?
Sure. So when you assess any patient, with or without a cardiology issue, but in this context, a cardiology issue, you typically begin by meeting the individual in the office, taking a history, doing a detailed physical examination, reviewing all of the medical records and the charts, looking at past procedures and tests that they may have had, sometimes speaking to other colleagues who you are caring for that patient with together. And then sometimes ordering your own tests for evaluation and diagnostic purposes.
Are some of your patients referred then from other cardiologists?
Yes. So because of my specialty in advanced heart disease, close to half the patients who are I'm seeing in the office as new patients have been referred to me by other cardiologists, typically in the community or in the region, and I will assist them in consultation to figure out what's going on and what we need to do to help that individual.
In the ICU, do you take care of patients who have problems beyond the heart?
Yes, so, it's interesting. As a cardiologist, I think part of the important reasons why they require of us to do that internal medicine residency training is because no organs work in isolation. And so my patients who have heart disease who also require the intensive care unit, they will usually have issues with many other organs, their lungs, their kidneys, sometimes their brain, their liver. And so you really have to be adept and have a really good understanding of not just the heart, but all of the organs of the body and really how they interact.
Dr. Rich, let's talk about your role in this litigation. How did you come to be involved in this case?
I was contacted by the state of Minnesota, and I was asked as a cardiologist if I could review the facts of this case to help determine how Mr. George Floyd died.
Have you been compensated by the state for the bulk of the work you've done on this case?
No, up until my time here now at trial, I have not received compensation.
And why not?
Probably for a couple of reasons. Mostly, I felt that my job as a cardiologist could really help inform the facts of this case. Every year, I take on a number of professional activities without compensation. I actually think it's a duty of our field. And so in this case, I felt I can make a meaningful contribution to the medical field.
So for your the compensation for your time while you're here at trial, are you being compensated at $1,200 per day?
Yeah, it's $1,200 a day while I'm missing work back at home.
So let's talk about then your opinion or opinions in this case. Before we do, could you tell us what work you did? What did you review before forming opinions in the case?
Sure. So I was provided with a lot of evidence to look through, but mostly I looked through the medical records, interviews, all the videos that were provided to me, and the autopsy report.
Did you review some journal articles as well?
Yeah, as I was formulating my opinion and creating my expert report, I also looked up journal articles and embedded them into my report for references.
Have you formed any opinions in this case to a reasonable degree of medical certainty? What's your opinion or opinions?
Sure. In this case, Mr. George Floyd died from a cardiopulmonary arrest. It was caused by low oxygen levels, and those low oxygen levels were induced by the prone restraint and positional asphyxiation that he was subjected to.
Well, let's discuss your opinion, Dr. Rich, and let's start it with just a general discussion of the circulatory system in the heart. So I'd like to talk about the right side of the heart, left side of the heart, and also the alveoli. Would you start off and just tell the jury, just remind them, what are the alveoli?
Sure. So you might remember hearing about this, but the alveoli are those grape-like structures that are at the very bottoms of the lungs. The alveoli is where the actual gas exchange occurs, meaning that is where, when we take a breath in, oxygen gets across the lungs and into the bloodstream, and then the carbon dioxide that needs to leave the body crosses that same barrier into those alveoli. So when we take our deep breath out, that's how the carbon dioxide is removed. So it's the alveoli of the lungs that serve that purpose.
And again, what does the heart do in the body?
What does the heart do? Well, the heart is the major pump, of course, of the body. The best way to think of the heart, in my view, is to actually think of it as two pumps, sort of a right side and a left side. So if we start with the right side of the heart, after all that blood got pumped to the body and is coming back to the heart, blood is always returned to the right side of the heart. So this is now blood that presumably does not have much oxygen in it, and it needs to get more oxygen. So the right side of the heart, its job is singular. It is to pump blood to the lungs, to those alveoli. So the blood, when it heads towards the lungs, it can pick up that oxygen that it doesn't have right now, and it can deliver carbon dioxide and other acids and waste products to be expelled from the body. Once that blood from the right side of the heart has picked up the oxygen that it needed, it sends it to the left side of the heart. Now, the left side of the heart gets all the glory because it is what then pumps all of that oxygen and nutrient-rich blood to the entire body, meaning to the lungs, to the kidneys, to the brain, to our muscles, to deliver oxygen, because every organ, every tissue of the body needs oxygen in order to function. And then once that process occurs, it repeats back to the right side and so forth.
And what happens if the lungs can't deliver sufficient oxygen to the heart? That is, if there's a low oxygen situation.
Okay, well, the heart is only as good as the fuel that it's provided with. So when that right side of the heart sends blood to the lungs and says, okay, can I have some oxygen, please? If there is no oxygen there, or not enough oxygen there, there is nothing the heart can do to extract more from the lungs. So it has to take that deoxygenated blood, that blood that does not have enough oxygen, and pump it to the left side of the body. The left side of the body says, okay, this is what I have. This is what I'm going to pump now. And so what ends up happening is if the lungs don't give enough oxygen to the body, the heart then has to pump insufficiently oxygenated blood to the tissues of the body, and that's when problems occur.
Well, then returning to your opinion, cardiopulmonary arrest caused by low oxygen induced by positional asphyxia. What caused the low level of oxygen in the case of Mr. George Floyd?
Well, in his case, it was truly the prone restraint and positional restraints that led to his asphyxiation. In a nutshell, he was just simply unable, using all of his muscles of respiration, his chest wall, what we call accessory muscles of respiration, which are extra muscles that will be triggered in the event that you're having trouble breathing. He was trying to get in enough oxygen, and because he was unable to, because of the position that he was subjected to, as we just discussed, the heart thus didn't have enough oxygen either, which then means the entire body is deprived of oxygen.
So, low oxygen induced by positional asphyxia. Did you consider other possible causes for Mr. Floyd's death?
Sure. I tried, of course, to be as thorough as possible, but I focused mostly on two other potential causes. Number one is whether there could have been a primary heart contribution to George Floyd's death, and the second was whether a drug overdose could have caused his death.
So, doctor, would you tell the jury what is a primary heart event?
Sure. So, a lot of things can injure the heart. For example, if you do not take in enough oxygen, that will injure all the organs, including the heart. When I use the term a primary heart event, I mean something that originated from the heart itself. So, for example, a heart attack. All right, one of the arteries of the heart just suddenly got blocked completely, and a heart attack occurred. Or the heart just, without any explanation, nothing else secondary inducing it, went into a serious ventricular arrhythmia. Okay, so the bottom part of the heart, that part that we were talking about that needs to pump blood to the body, suddenly went into a chaotic rhythm all on its own. If any of those things happened, then I would consider that a primary heart issue, not being caused or secondary to something else.
So you considered whether or not Mr. Floyd might have passed away from a primary heart event or a drug overdose. Did you reach an opinion or conclusion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether either of those two causes explain Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I did.
Would you tell us your opinion?
Sure. After reviewing all of the facts and evidence of the case, I can state with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from a drug overdose.
Thank you, Dr. Rich. Would you tell us what evidence or facts, documents, what did you look at to help you to reach that conclusion about primary heart event and or drug overdose?
Sure. The three aspects of the evidence that I spent the most time reviewing were Mr. George Floyd's medical records, the videos, the different angles from the day that he died on May 25th, 2020, and the autopsy report.
So the medical records, the videos, and then the autopsy report.
Yes.
Let's start with the medical records then of those three. Would you tell the jury what you were looking for in the medical records?
Sure. So you get the medical records. It's usually pretty thick, but you take it one page at a time. And at the outset, I was looking to see if he had been diagnosed with any medical conditions. That's sort of the first step. Kind of just what you do with a patient in the office, sort of what medical problems do you have? And so I was looking to see initially what diagnoses George Floyd may have previously been diagnosed with.
And what were your takeaways then from having looked at the medical records and done this assessment?
So at that level, I felt pretty confident that Mr. Floyd had three medical problems. Number one, he had hypertension, high blood pressure. Number two, it appeared to me that he may have suffered from anxiety. And three, it looked like he also struggled with substance abuse.
Other than those three conditions, did Mr. Floyd have any diagnosis of heart disease while he was still alive?
No, he did not.
So you said you looked at the medical records not only for diagnoses of pre-existing conditions, but also for evidence of medical encounters?
Correct.
And by that you mean hospital visits, clinics, etc.?
Emergency room visits, exactly.
What did you find in that regard?
So this is, in my opinion, was a really important part of the review as well, because every time Mr. Floyd had an encounter with a medical professional, I viewed that as an opportunity to see if there was any signs, symptoms whatsoever, even subtle, that could have indicated, for example, that he had anything going on with his heart. And so at the emergency room visits, he had one prolonged hospitalization. I really tried to take a look at everything. I looked at any opportunity I could to see if he ever complained of chest pain, which he did not. Palpitations, which is a fluttering sensation of the heart. I reviewed all of the documented physical examinations of his heart to see if there were any abnormalities noted, and there were not. No murmurs, nothing found. I looked at all of his labs that get sent to see if there were any cardiac markers of injury, which he did not have. I reviewed his EKGs and his other tests. I tried to be as thorough as possible because I view what we do as a clinician in some ways as actually being a bit of a detective. And our job is to try to figure out what might be going on, even if it's not overtly stated so in the chart.
Would you tell the jury, by the way, what an EKG is?
Sure, of course. So an EKG is shorthand for an electrocardiogram. That's the test where you'll see people put these little sticky things on the chest. We call them electrodes. And what an EKG basically is an opportunity at the surface level of the chest, but the technology is so fascinating. It can give you a glimpse into the heart itself to see a whole host of things, including, is there any evidence of any heart injury happening now or previously? Any abnormal heart rhythms? A whole host of other information that we can get from the EKG at that snapshot in time. And then sometimes what we'll do is we'll repeat EKGs down the line so we can compare and contrast and see if anything had changed.
So you looked at all of this medical information on Mr. Floyd, including the EKG. Did you note any cardiac problems that related to Mr. Floyd?
I noted no cardiac problems in the medical records as far as Mr. Floyd's medical condition was concerned, including everything I mentioned, the EKG, even a time where they put him on a continuous cardiac telemetry monitor, which they'll do sometimes just to see beat to beat if anything's going on. I reviewed that as well.
Did you see any evidence of Mr. Floyd having had any abnormal heart rhythms?
His EKG showed absolutely no abnormal heart rhythms. He had that cardiac telemetry that I mentioned that he had on for a few days, did have on a rare occasion something you would call a PVC, which is a very normal finding. I don't know if anyone's ever felt their carotid flutter for a second or something like that. It happens to all of us. But absolutely no ventricular arrhythmias for the duration of the time that he was on the monitor.
And PVC is not a kind of plastic pipe. You mean preventricular contraction?
Yeah,
right?
premature ventricular contraction. Sometimes people refer to it as a skipped beat. A really normal phenomenon. If you drink a little coffee or anything else, you're sleep deprived. It's pretty common for us to have those totally normal findings, something that none of you should be concerned about if you feel that from time to time.
So did you find any evidence that Mr. Floyd had any negative heart conditions?
There was absolutely no evidence to suggest that at all.
Dr. Rich, isn't high blood pressure an abnormal heart condition?
So thank you for that question, because I think that's an area of confusion sometimes. So high blood pressure in and of itself is not a heart condition. High blood pressure occurs for basically two reasons. Number one, high blood pressure originates in the blood vessels of our bodies. Oftentimes it's genetically determined why our blood pressure might start to go up over time. If you have a strong heart, you can also generate high blood pressures, and so those two in combination. So why? Well, so I'll pause there and can explain more.
Well, did Mr. Floyd have a strong heart?
So every indicator is that Mr. Floyd had actually an exceptionally strong heart because he was able to generate pressures of upwards of 200 millimeters of mercury on some occasions. We talked a little earlier about my role as a heart transplant cardiologist. One of the problems with patients when they need a heart transplant is the exact opposite. Their hearts are so weak they can't generate a high blood pressure. Their top number might just be 80. The reason why high blood pressure, though, is important, and it is important to treat high blood pressure, is because over time, if high blood pressure goes untreated, 10, 20, 30 years, the impact of that high pressure on the heart can eventually start to become a bit of a problem. So the way I explain it to my patients who come into the office and I talk to them about treating their high blood pressure is I say, remember, the heart is a muscle. So if you go to the gym and you pick up a couple of dumbbells and you start to lift the weights, initially it feels fine. In fact, you probably get a little stronger. Your your muscle will likely get even a little thicker, a little bigger, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. And initially, that might actually be a really good thing. But if I came back, 10 years later and said, how's it going? You'd say, man, this is getting pretty tough. And then the muscle can start to tire out. So we do want to treat high blood pressure. I can't emphasize that enough. High blood pressure should be treated, but high blood pressure in and of itself is not a heart condition.
So we've talked about your review of the medical records. You told us that you also looked at video footage in forming your opinions. Would you tell us what you were looking for in the video footage that you examined?
Sure. So my approach to the video initially was sort of similar to my approach with the medical records, meaning I wanted to just do some cursory inspection, observation, basic stuff. What did Mr. Floyd look like? Was Mr. Floyd talking? And if he was talking, was he talking clearly, coherently, answering questions appropriately? Did I notice any evidence of abnormal physical exams on the video? Actually, I was trying to look for as well. When Mr. Floyd was walking, did he appear like he was walking without difficulty, or was it looking like he was perhaps with low blood pressure and maybe gonna fall down? I was listening for any opportunity I could to hear. He might say, I'm having chest pain, or I'm having those palpitations or fluttering sensations. Basically doing what I do when I assess any person for a possible medical problem. I was looking for any and all of those possible subtle signs.
And so this is video footage from Mr. Floyd's encounter on May 25th of last year.
May 25th, that's correct.
We're focused on things that would give you any insights into his ability to breathe.
Yes, of course.
And the ability to expand what's referred to as his chest wall.
Yes.
Again, to refresh the recollection of the jury, what is the chest wall?
Yeah, so the chest wall, which I'm trying to sort of show you with my hands here, basically makes up the bones and the muscles of the entire rib cage. And it might have been explained previously to you, but the chest wall and the muscles and how they interact, along with the diaphragm muscle inside, are the key structures that determine if someone is able to take in enough air and able to get enough out. So if there is, for example, the lungs can be working okay, but if the chest wall is diseased, if the muscles associated with the chest wall aren't able to contract and move and do their job, enough oxygen can't get in that way either.
So doctor, in our COVID world, do you make clinical assessments of your patients in your work life by video?
Yes, actually, that is one of the transformations that we have needed to adapt to this past year. We're getting back to now seeing most of our patients in person, but during the course of this pandemic, to minimize exposures, we've set up a lot of these tele-video visits with patients, And what I came to appreciate is that while there's no substitute to actually putting your hands on a patient, that's still preferable, in my opinion, to really examine them closely. You can get a lot of information off of a video assessment, even physical examination, by looking at, I have them turn their neck to the side and I can see their neck veins, which is an indicator of pressures. I can see their legs to look if there's any indication of swelling, which might be congestive heart failure. Of course, I could just see the patient. I can see how they're breathing. I can hear how they're talking, if they seem breathless or short of breath. So we actually have found out that we can do a lot via video assessments.
Were you able to then see Mr. Floyd at the period of time after he was first approached by the police on May 25th, 2020?
Yes.
What were your observations about Mr. Floyd from that initial encounter with the police?
So from his initial encounter, remembering particularly when he was asked to get out of his car, he appeared fearful, but was speaking, I thought, clearly, answering questions appropriately. Didn't see any acute, what we would call acute distress. I saw no indicators at that time that he was suffering from low oxygen, for example, or from any active medical problem. And as I said, I was really trying to keep a close eye on some of the subtleties of his appearance and speech and so forth.
Were you able to observe at the point that he was being asked to get into the squad car?
Yes, I was.
What were your observations with respect to that period of time?
Yeah, so I watched him walk to the squad car, and then I was observing an interaction where they were asking him to get into the back seat of the car. I heard him talking about how he was claustrophobic. There were times when he was being, I'm not sure if it was pushed into the car or how it was. It had even made indicators at that time that he couldn't breathe. But all of my observations at that point were still that up until the point that he was kind of getting pushed or pulled through the car and ultimately onto the pavement, up until that point, I also saw no evidence that there was anything active going on from a cardiac standpoint. And that was really important for me to conclude.
And what sort of active thing might you have been looking for related to the heart over that period of time?
Yeah, so for example, let's say that he was having an arrhythmia, an abnormal heart rhythm, especially if it was originating from the heart. Oftentimes what will happen is you'll have the heart rhythm that goes abnormal, and you'll go from being like totally fine, like hopefully we all are here today, to instantly dizzy or even passing out. I didn't see any indicators that that was happening. I didn't hear him complaining of dizziness or, again, fluttering of the chest. I couldn't see any swelling in his body. Again, I didn't want to take anything for granted that even from the initial encounter up until that point, what if something developed from point A to point B? And so again, up until that point, I saw no indicators of low blood pressure or anything else abnormal with the heart.
Then turning then to the restraint on the ground that you were referring to, what were your observations then as a cardiologist from your having viewed Mr. Floyd's restraint on the ground by Mr. Chauvin? Sure.
So my observations were that he was restrained in a life-threatening manner. Specifically, my observations was that he was on the ground in the prone position, handcuffed, hands behind the back, a knee on the back of his neck, a knee on the back of his upper torso or shoulder, hands pushing his handcuffed hands further up into his chest. I observed a knee compressing his, I thought it was his buttocks or upper thighs, and then at various points, his lower limbs, his lower extremities being pinned down to the ground. So that my initial observation was, what is the position, first and foremost, that he is being subjected to?
And did you see at some point in you watching the video that Mr. Floyd went into cardiopulmonary arrest?
Eventually, yes, I did.
Do you know what Mr. Floyd's heart rhythm was when he was taken from the scene?
Well, so in the course of the restraint, I was looking to see if his deterioration occurred rapidly, like I was just talking about. For example, a primary cardiac event, the most common arrhythmia is what we call ventricular fibrillation, or VF for short, VFib. When that happens, the individual will look relatively okay, meaning they're alert, they're talking, and then they will immediately become unconscious. On the other hand, if the cause of the cardiopulmonary arrest was from something else, for example, low oxygen levels, you will typically see that deterioration happening much more gradually and slowly. So my observations were the second, that you could see, at least I could see, his speech starting to become less forceful, his muscle movements becoming weaker, until, of course, eventually his speech became absent, eventually his muscle movements were absent, and then as we later discovered by the heart rhythm, he was in a PEA, cardiopulmonary arrest.
So I'd like to talk with you about two concepts. The one being PEA, which is pulseless electrical activity, and the other one being a thing called a systole.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So first, Dr. Rich, would you tell us what pulseless electrical activity is?
Sure. So pulseless electrical activity, or for short PEA, is a chaotic heart rhythm that you can see on the EKG or on the cardiac monitor, but there is an absence of a pulse. And so it doesn't meet criteria for this asystole that I think we'll talk about in a minute, or for ventricular fibrillation. Ventricular fibrillation, if I'll just use my fingers, is basically the heart rhythm looking like this. Okay, it's this little subtle fluttering, but basically nothing else going on. Pulseless electrical activity, if you are a clinician, a doctor, or a nurse, or anyone for that matter, who's ever been trained in cardiac arrest, one of the things that will come to mind immediately is whenever you see a PEA arrest, you need to think about what's causing it, because nearly all